Welcome, curious minds, to the deep dive. We plunge into fascinating stories and surface with those nuggets you need to be really well informed. And today we're embarking on a really deep dive into the extraordinary life and the very complex legacy of Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich. It's a story that just makes you want to dig deeper. It presents this striking paradox right from the get-go. How could this simple, apparently uneducated peasant woman from the 18th century, stuck in a sickbed for years, how does she become this powerful figure, influencing a huge Hollywood movie, leading to the discovery of an ancient pilgrimage site that popes visit even? And all while facing intense skepticism, intense church scrutiny. It's quite something.
It really is. And what's so fascinating here is exactly that, how her personal holiness, her sanctity, became so tangled up with these grand historical, even theological debates, especially around the whole nature of private revelation within the church. Her life, it genuinely challenges a lot of our assumptions, I think.
Absolutely. So we're going to explore her profound spiritual experiences, her physical suffering, which was immense, and yes, the controversies, the enduring controversies around this huge body of visions attributed to her.
Right. It's not just a couple of visions here and there. We're talking about this vast, detailed spiritual narrative.
Exactly. Something that shaped history and faith for, millions.
And for this deep dive, we're drawing on a really rich stack of sources so we can unpack the different layers here. We've looked at historical accounts, quite rigorous theological studies, and even official statements from the Vatican.
Right.
So the aim is to give you a really nuanced picture, help you understand what makes her such a compelling figure, and sometimes a hotly debated one in Catholic history.
The story of Anne Catherine Emmerich, it really is remarkable. Some parts feel almost unbelievable, it just forces you to think about the impact one seemingly humble life can have.
And to really grasp the later stuff, the mystical phenomena, the stigmata, the visions, you first have to understand her early life. It was this unique crucible, really, forged in intense piety, yes, but also stark paradox, and all set against this backdrop of huge political and religious upheaval in Europe.
Right.
Her personal response to all that, it was shaped by this deep inner spirituality, but also externally by extreme poverty.
Okay, so let's go right back to the very beginning of her journey. Anne Catherine Emmerich, born September 8th, 1774. In a small farming community, Flamsch, near Coesfeld in Westphalia, so modern Germany. And that date, September 8th, that rings a bell in Catholic tradition, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. And for many people looking back, it seems symbolically significant, almost, providential. September 8th is the Feast of the Nativity of the Blessed Virgin Mary.
Okay.
And given Emmerich's really profound Marian devotion her whole life and her later visions detailing Mary's life so extensively, many saw that birthday as a kind of divine foreshadowing. She was one of 9 children. Her parents, Bernard Emmerich and Anne Hiller, were described as devout, certainly, but utterly poor peasants. In that time and place, for a large poor family, survival meant everyone pitched in from a very young age. Hard farm labor, household chores. It was relentless.
Yeah, I can imagine. And that kind of life, just the sheer struggle to survive, must have meant very little formal schooling. Hard for a peasant family back then. Every pair of hands was needed just to eat, right?
Absolutely.
So how did she end up with such, profound spiritual knowledge?
And that's the paradox right there.
Yeah.
A key insight into her path. Despite almost no formal education, maybe a few months, basic stuff, people who knew her said she was remarkably well instructed in religion. But this knowledge didn't seem to come from books or formal teaching. It seemed to flow from this innate spiritual sensitivity, a deep intuitive prayer life. It was like she had this internal source. Her understanding came directly from this spiritual connection, not academics.
Which kind of defies our usual expectations, right? That wisdom isn't always in the classroom.
Exactly. Sometimes it's in the most humble, unexpected places.
And this leads to one of the most striking things about her early life, this idea of a seamless integration of the supernatural. You said it was almost ordinary for her.
That's a crucial point for understanding her, yeah. She apparently said later that in her innocent ignorance, she thought all children had the same experience as she did.
Wow.
These weren't just fleeting glimpses. She talked about familiar, ongoing conversations with a child Jesus, her guardian angel, various saints. They just appear to her regularly. She reportedly felt more comfortable with them, with these spiritual realities, than with earthly companions.
Incredible.
For her, the veil between the natural and supernatural was just incredibly thin, this constant communion with the divine. It gave her reality a depth most of us can, only imagine.
And this perception wasn't just about saints and angels. She seemed to have this intuitive sense about objects, places, even people.
Yes, and this was a practical aspect of her gift, too. She could apparently tell if an object was truly blessed by the church or just ordinary, or she'd feel this pull, almost physical, towards saints' relics, sensing their power. But it worked the other way, too. She'd feel this distinct physical repulsion from places where serious sins happened, or like old pagan cemeteries, sensing a disturbance.
Wow. And this led to her being known locally as the bright little sister.
That's right. This intuitive discernment also came out as a kind of clairvoyance. People from nearby villages would come to her, even when she was young. She had this uncanny knack for diagnosing illnesses and suggesting simple herbal remedies for the sick and poor.
Without any training.
No medical training. She just seemed to know what was needed. Giving practical advice that worked, it earned her a lot of trust, a lot of affection in her community.
And underneath all this, there was this really deep devotion to the souls in purgatory. Not just saying a prayer, but something more active.
Oh, far more active. It was a central theme of her piety, really her whole life. She didn't just pray for them, she claimed she actually saw them.
Saw them.
Yes, and felt this deep compulsion to pray and offer sacrifices specifically for their relief. It wasn't passive at all. She described being woken up at night by suffering souls, hearing their pleas. And then, as penance, she'd follow them barefoot on the way of the cross, even in the dead of winter.
Barefoot in winter. Goodness.
Offering up that suffering to help their purification. This intense practice, this vicarious suffering, starting so young. It really foreshadowed her later life. It was the foundation for the immense suffering she would later endure.
So with this incredibly intense spiritual life, it's no wonder she felt this overpowering desire for religious life, for a convent. But even with these obvious gifts, the path wasn't smooth at all.
No, remarkably difficult. Lots of worldly obstacles. Her father initially didn't want her to go, needed her help at home. But even when he agreed, the main persistent problem wasn't family, it was money, economic.
Dowry?
Exactly, the required dowry. She applied repeatedly, Augustinians, Trappists, Port Clares, but kept getting rejected. Her family was just too poor to pay, which was common then. Convents needed funds. But it put her deep spiritual calling directly against the, material realities of the church structure at the time.
That must have been crushing, having this clear calling but being blocked by money.
You can imagine. So with the convent doors shut, she had to find another way. Working hard, saving everything she could.
Yeah.
She worked for years, first as a farmhand, then as a seamstress, trying to scrape together that dowry. And then there's this amazing story of the Sunken family in Münster. It really shows her radical charity.
What happened there?
Well, the Port Clares said they'd take her if she learned to play the organ. So she went to live with the organist's family, the Sunkens, to learn.
Okay, seems like a path forward.
But when she got there, she found the Sunken family was even poorer than her own. Sick, struggling terribly. And in this incredible act of self-giving, she just gave them the money she'd saved for her own dowry.
She gave away her dowry money.
The whole lot. Basically gave up her immediate hope of the convent. And she became their servant, instead caring for them, teaching the kids, sharing whatever she had. It got so bad, her own mother had to bring her food sometimes, which Anne Catherine would then share with the Sunkens. Just profound empathy.
Wow, truly putting others first. So there's this tension, isn't there? The institution needs money, but her personal actions are pure gospel charity.
Exactly. That period shows the tension perfectly. The system, the dowry, was this huge material barrier. But her life embodied this radical adherence to the gospel's economy of grace and charity. And how she finally got in wasn't through money she saved. It was, providence maybe, and generosity. The Sunken parents, whose daughter Clara also wanted to be a nun, were so moved by Anne Catherine's example, they made it a condition for their own daughter joining the Augustinians in Dülmen in 1802. Anne Catherine had to be accepted too.
So they insisted.
They insisted. So her spiritual value was finally recognized, you could say. It overcame the material lack that had blocked her for so long. A powerful story of spiritual worth winning out.
So after all that struggle, all that sacrifice, she's finally in. The Augustinian convent in Dülmen. Was it the peaceful spiritual haven she dreamed of?
Not exactly. Another paradox. She entered in 1802, age 28, with her friend Clara Ascension, took her vows in 1803, and she threw herself into convent life. Total fervor. Happy to be seen as the lowest, doing the hardest tasks, cheerful about it, deeply committed to the rule.
But her intensity caused friction. even there.
It did, unfortunately. Her strict observance, her frequent ecstasies, sometimes she'd go into these trance-like states, and her chronic poor health, needing extra care. It disturbed some of the, let's say, more tepid sisters.
Hmm.
They viewed her with suspicion, maybe annoyance. Her poor background didn't help. She got little respect, faced antipathy, gossip. Some thought she was faking the ecstasies, maybe jealous, or just uncomfortable with her intensity.
That sounds incredibly painful. Spiritual isolation within the very community she longed for.
It was a deep cross for her, bearing misunderstanding, hostility, but in quiet submission. Heroic, almost. Instead of bitterness, she went back to that vicarious suffering idea. She prayed to bear the punishment for the sins against charity her sisters committed against her.
Wow.
So this hidden suffering in the cloister was just an intensification of the penance she'd practiced since childhood. Deep spiritual isolation, even surrounded by others. Her mission was redemptive suffering.
And then, on top of the internal struggles, external forces just smash her world apart. The
Yeah.
Napoleonic secularization.
Exactly. In 1811, her enclosed world just shattered. An edict from Jerome Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother, King of Westphalia. He suppressed the convent. This was happening all over Napoleonic Europe, closing monasteries, convents, seizing assets, scattering communities, trying to weaken the church's power.
Right.
For Anne Catherine, it was the abrupt end of her cloistered life.
And this forced expulsion, it led to this huge, maybe ironic, unintended consequence, didn't it? This is where her story really goes public.
Absolutely. Forced out, homeless, religiously speaking, she found refuge first with a poor widow, then worked as a housekeeper for an exiled French priest. But this expulsion was the pivotal turning point. Completely changed her destiny. Inside the convent, her mystical experiences, the beginning of the stigmata, were mostly private, known to her confessor, maybe a few sisters.
Contained.
Exactly, contained. But the state's action, meant to weaken the church, ironically broke down the very walls that contained her. It thrust her into the public sphere, created the conditions for her phenomena to become widely known. Attracting devotion, yes, but also controversy, official scrutiny, everything that defined her legacy.
So without Napoleon, she might have just remained an obscure nun.
Quite possibly. Instead, the secularizing impulse inadvertently set the stage for one of the 19th century's most famous Catholic mystics. Her private suffering became a public testimony.
Okay, so now she's out in the world, more visible. And her health, already fragile, just collapsed entirely.
That's right. Soon after the convent closed, her health just gave out. Culmination of years of frailty, intense suffering. In 1813, she became permanently bedridden and stayed that way for the last 11 years of her life.
11 years bedridden.
And it wasn't sudden. She'd had periods of immobility before, like 6 years after an accident in 1806. But from 1813 on, her bed was her world. A crucible of suffering, yes, but also, paradoxically, a center of intense spiritual activity.
And during this time, she reportedly experienced an idia, surviving only on water and the Eucharist. That's an incredible claim.
It is an extraordinary claim, widely reported by those who cared for her, visited her. But the paradox is, her sickbed in Dolmen wasn't a place of quiet decline. It became this vibrant spiritual hub.
A destination.
A destination for pilgrims, all sorts of people, poor and sick seeking prayers, counsel, but also really prominent figures in the German Catholic renewal, people like the future Archbishop of Cologne, Clemens August Drustus Vischering, theologian Johann Michael Saylor, and crucially for her legacy, the poet Clemens Brentano. Even completely weak, unable to move or eat much, she apparently kept doing works of charity, sewing clothes for poor children from her bed. Her compassion, her spiritual magnetism weren't dimmed by illness.
And her story ends with her death in 1824. But even after death, there is something remarkable, something that solidified her reputation.
Indeed. Her health worsened in 1823, and she died peacefully on February 9, 1824. Huge funeral in Dolmen testament to her local reputation for sanctity. Then, 6 weeks later, this remarkable thing happened. Rumors started that her body had been stolen. Grave robbing for medical cadavers was a fear then. So the authorities ordered an exhumation, and when they opened the coffin, her body was found perfectly preserved. No signs of corruption at all.
Incorruptibility. That's a traditional sign of holiness in Catholic tradition, right? In the lives of the saints.
It is, and a very powerful one. For the local people, this was profound, non-textual confirmation, a tangible sign from God. In a life that would become so wrapped up in controversy over texts, visions, this direct physical sign was foundational, easy to understand, proof of her special status.
Right. No interpretation needed there.
Exactly. It anchored her reputation, probably sustained devotion even when the writings came under scrutiny later. Her remains were eventually moved to the Church of the Holy Cross in Dolmen, which is now a major pilgrimage site. You can even see a reconstruction of her sick room there.
Now, of all the mystical phenomena, the stigmata are maybe the most visible, certainly the most discussed. How did these wounds appear?
Well, the experience of the Passion started internally, long before it showed physically. As early as 1798, when she was still a laywoman, she reported agonizing pains like the crown of thorns, piercing pain in her head, sometimes visible bleeding from her head on Fridays.
Which she tried to hide.
Always tried to hide it, wrapped her head. But the full external stigmata, they appeared spontaneously on December 29, 1812. Shortly after she became bedridden, it followed intense prayer, where she asked to share more fully in Christ's sufferings. Then suddenly, wounds on her hands, feet, side, matching the crucifixion wounds, plus other marks, 2 crosses over her heart. They caused excruciating, constant pain. But her reaction was always humility, trying to hide them. A private burden, not for show.
And these wounds weren't static, they changed, responded to her prayers. That sounds like a dynamic thing.
That's right, not static at all, which is remarkable. End of 1818, she prayed intensely to be relieved of the visible signs in her hands and feet. Why? Because of the publicity, the scrutiny, she found it distressing.
Understandable.
And in response, those wounds reportedly closed over, became almost invisible scars, though the other marks on her head, heart, they remained. But then, on subsequent Good Fridays, all the wounds, visible and closed, would apparently reopen for the day, renewing her agonizing participation in the Passion, a profound cyclical experience of suffering.
This sounds deeply connected to that idea of victim soul's redemptive suffering. Can you explain that framework again, how it applies here?
Yes, it's crucial for understanding her, and many Catholic mystics. A victim soul is someone who voluntarily accepts suffering and consciously unites it with Christ's passion. It's not passive endurance. It's actively offered for specific intentions, saving sinners, relieving souls in purgatory, strengthening the church.
Okay.
Her whole life was a testament to this. She explicitly prayed to take on others' sufferings, from her nun's lack of charity to the sins of people she didn't even know. Praying for specific individuals while in pain, she saw her mission as spiritual reparation, making amends for sin, strengthening faith in a time she saw as one of crisis and piety.
She even took on others' physical ailments.
Reportedly, yes. Taking on the physical sickness or spiritual struggles of dying people to help them have a peaceful, holy death. Her life was just this ongoing act of self-offering.
So, with phenomena this dramatic, especially the stigmata, investigations were inevitable, and they came from 2 very different angles, reflecting the times.
They did. The contrast is really stark, very telling. First, an Episcopal Commission in 1813, church-initiated. Led by the respected Vicar General Overberg, included 3 doctors. Their framework was faith-based. They accepted the possibility of the supernatural. Goal? Discern genuine sanctity from pious fraud.
And their conclusion?
After a strict and scrupulous investigation observing her, examining wounds, interviewing witnesses, they were convinced of her personal holiness and the authenticity of the stigmata. No sign of fakery. Her suffering was real, her humility genuine.
But then came the government investigation. Given the Napoleonic context, they must have had a totally different agenda.
Starkly different. The 1819 government investigation reflected Enlightenment skepticism, often anti-clerical views of the Prussian state. They started assuming fraud. Their methods weren't theological discernment, they were police interrogation. She was forcibly removed from home, isolated from friends, spiritual directors, under 247 surveillance for 3 weeks. Yes. Government observers, doctors, even a female attendant watching constantly. Subjected to insults, threats, psychological pressure. The goal was clearly to expose her as a fraud, discredit the church's influence, prove it was a trick or delusion.
And the outcome of these 2 very different approaches, this clash of worldviews.
The government investigation, despite its harshness, ended in failure. They couldn't find any evidence of fraud, no proof of self-infliction, deception. They left without a conclusive report.
Which, for her supporters, must have been huge.
A powerful vindication. Even secular authorities, biased as they were, couldn't disprove it. So this clash of inquiries is like a mini picture of the bigger 19th century conflict. Church versus state, faith versus rationalism.
Yeah.
And Anne Catherine's suffering body was the literal battleground. Her steadfastness under that pressure just deepened the belief in her holiness for those who believed.
Beyond the stigmata, she's maybe even more famous for her visions, this huge body of visionary material. And the scope is just staggering, isn't it? It seems to cover everything.
Truly staggering. This is where her legacy gets even bigger. Her visions weren't just on one theme. They covered, you could say, the entirety of the Judeo-Christian narrative, millennia of history. starting with creation, fall of angels, Adam and Eve, Old Testament patriarchs, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Job, even figures like Melchizedek, elaborate narratives for the whole New Testament, lives of the apostles, other saints, in incredible detail.
But the core focus was
Two main things: the life of the Blessed Virgin Mary, her parents, Joachim and Anne, Immaculate Conception, final years, Assumption, and maybe most famously, the life of Jesus Christ, especially his dolorous passion, suffering, death, resurrection in graphic detail, plus visions of heaven, hell, purgatory, even prophetic insights into the Church's future trials. It's encyclopedic.
she apparently described them like a picture book of salvation history. What does that tell us about the style? Sounds incredibly vivid.
It's a great analogy. Her visions were vivid, incredibly detailed, concrete. The narratives are hyper-detailed, told in this direct eyewitness style. Not abstract theology. They fill the gaps in the Bible stories with tons of extra-biblical details.
Like what?
Verbatim conversations between figures, their inner thoughts, emotions, specific descriptions of clothes, buildings, the Holy Land environment. Like the accounts trace the history and describe the physical details of the chalice used at the Last Supper from Abraham to Christ.
Wow.
Or they follow Mary's movements and sorrows step by step through the Passion, details not in the Gospels. It's like watching a high-def historical documentary, not reading a summary.
And this tangible, immediate, almost historical feel, it really clicked with the 19th century mood, didn't it? Maybe served a purpose for people then.
Absolutely. It found a very ready audience. Think about the time. Rising literacy, historical novels becoming popular, and the Bible starting to face rationalist scrutiny through historical critical methods.
Right, challenging the traditional views.
Exactly. So her visions offer this powerful counter-narrative. They re-enchanted the biblical world, turned the concise Gospels into this rich, emotional, seemingly historically detailed drama. It acted as a kind of popular apologetics, gave the faithful a version of their sacred history that felt as concrete as any secular account, made it feel more resilient to those intellectual challenges, comforting, inspiring for many.
And beyond the historical scenes, there were prophetic elements, too. You mentioned Napoleon.
That's right. Her reported foresight of Napoleon's downfall 12 years early impressed many. She also apparently gave mysterious advice to the Pope. But the most famous, most compelling claim of this type, with real-world consequences, involves the Virgin Mary's last home.
Ah, yes, the Ephesus discovery. This is amazing because she never left her region in Germany, right?
Never left Westphalia. Yet she provided these precise details about a house near ancient Ephesus in Turkey, where she said Mary lives out her final years with St. John.
And someone actually went and found it based on her descriptions. That sounds like incredible validation.
It did happen, yes. And for many, it is the most compelling evidence. Decades after her death, in 1881, a French priest, Abbé Julien Gouillet, traveled to Turkey. He used the precise geographical and architectural descriptions from her published visions as his guide, details about the terrain, a nearby spring, the house layout.
Oh.
He located the ruins of a small stone house on a hill near Ephesus, Bulbuldaya, Nightingale Mountain. The ruins matched her descriptions with uncanny accuracy. This discovery, later supported by others, visited by popes. It serves for many believers as the single most powerful piece of external verification, moves her story from subjective experience to what looks like verifiable physical evidence.
And that site, Mariam Ana Azi, House of Mary, is a major pilgrimage site now.
Huge. Hundreds of thousands of visitors every year.
Okay, so we have these vast, detailed visions, but Anne Catherine herself didn't write them down, which brings us to this critical and deeply problematic figure, Clemens Brentano. Without him, we might not even know these visions.
Exactly. You cannot talk about Emmerich critically without confronting Clemens Brentano. He's central and the source of the main controversy. He wasn't just some neutral note-taker. He was a leading German Romantic poet, famous writer, who'd had this profound religious conversion. Friends persuaded him to visit the stigmatic of Dillman in 1818 or 1819. He was intrigued by the stories.
And their meeting was apparently quite dramatic, almost predestined from Brentano's view.
According to Brentano's own fervent account, yes. Emmerich, having never seen him, supposedly recognized him instantly from a vision, told him God had pointed him out as the one chosen to record her revelations.
Wow.
Brentano was utterly captivated by her piety, her suffering, her visions. He revered her as a chosen bride of Christ. He saw his work not just as literary, but as a sacred mission from God, a divine calling.
So he dropped everything.
Pretty much. Abandoned his successful literary career. Dedicated the next 6 years until her death in 1824 to sitting by her bed almost daily, writing down everything. A huge personal commitment, a total life change.
A sacred mission. That sounds like a really intense, psychologically charged relationship between the poet and the visionary. How did that deep investment affect his work?
It was definitely a complex, psychologically charged symbiosis. Brentano was a romantic poet, grappling with his own personal complexes, emotional turmoil, searching for authentic spirituality. For him, this simple, pious nun might have been the spiritual anchor, a source of authentic, uncorrupted, pre-modern truth, a direct line to the divine he craved.
Right.
This deep personal, emotional investment inevitably influenced his work. It wasn't just transcription. It became interpretation, arguably even co-creation. He wasn't just a stenographer. He was a romantic poet, capturing what he saw as transcendent truth. That process was bound to color things.
And the actual process of getting the visions down on paper sounds incredibly difficult. Lots of room for Brentano's own voice or research to creep in.
Precisely. That's the mechanical difficulty that fueled the later controversy. He'd visit daily, sometimes for hours, listen to her accounts, often while she was in a visionary state. But she only spoke her local Westphalian dialect, Low German. Brentano had to translate that into standard High German, either as he listened or from memory later.
From memory.
Often, yes. Especially during ecstasies or intense suffering, he couldn't take notes directly. So he'd go back to his lodgings and reconstruct conversations, visions, sometimes hours later. That's inherently prone to gaps or embellishments.
But didn't he read it back to her for approval so she could correct things?
According to his account, yes. He said he'd meticulously read his German version back. They'd correct it until she approved. But think about the sheer volume of material, her frequent suffering, the translation involved. How thoroughly could she really review and filter his interpretations? It's a fair question.
Right.
And after she died in 1824, Brentano had this mountain of notes, supposedly 16,000 pages. He spent years editing, arranging, compiling them. Years. The Dolorous Passion wasn't published until 1833, 9 years after her death. The Life of the Blessed Virgin Mary came out even later, after Brentano himself died in 1842. This long, multi-stage process, listening, remembering, translating, writing, then extensive editing years later, it makes it nearly impossible to isolate a pure, unmediated voice of Emmerich in the published books. It's filtered through so many layers.
Which brings us right to the core issue: authenticity. Scholarly investigations, even early on, doubted how much was Anne Catherine and how much was Brentano.
They did. And this suspicion isn't modern skepticism. It arose relatively early within the Church. It became the central obstacle to her canonization cause. When her beatification cause opened in 1892, it triggered serious scholarly examination in Germany. Experts got access to Brentano's original notebooks, started comparing them to the polished books.
And they found
What many saw as damning evidence. Among Brentano's papers, various apocryphal biblical sources, texts related to the Bible but not canonical, detailed maps of the Holy Land, travel guides, material he could have used. Exactly. Materials he could have used to flesh out her simpler accounts. Adding geographical details, narrative flourishes she might not have provided herself, raised serious questions.
And this led to Winfried Höpfner's thesis. That really solidified the doubts.
Yes, a landmark moment. 1923, a theological thesis by German priest Winfried Höpfner. He meticulously compared Brentano's original, often messy notes to the carefully crafted published books. His conclusion, Brentano had fabricated a significant portion of the material, showed how Brentano hadn't just edited, but dramatically expanded, sometimes invented details.
Fabricated, that's strong.
It was. By 1928, the scholarly consensus was that only a small fraction of the famous books could be confidently attributed to Emmerich herself. And even that fraction was hard to isolate. This was so damaging, raised such profound doubts about reliability, it directly led to the suspension of her beatification cause for almost 50 years. The visions were seen as integral then, so discrediting them stopped the process.
So, when the cause finally reopened and succeeded decades later, what was the Vatican's official stance on these contested texts? Did they validate them?
No, absolutely not. When the cause reopened and eventually succeeded, the Vatican made a clear and deliberate distinction, a pivotal move. The Church's judgment explicitly acknowledged the serious problem of authenticity with the texts. Father Peter Gumpel, a respected Jesuit historian, expert judge for the causes of saints, stated very clearly around the 2004 beatification the writings were absolutely discarded from the process.
Absolutely discarded.
Yes. The reason was unambiguous. It was impossible for investigators to reliably distinguish between Emmerich's authentic visionary content and Brentano's own embroidery or additions. So the Church beatified the person for her virtues, not the books. A crucial separation.
And beyond just historical accuracy or Brentano adding things, there were some really problematic passages in the texts themselves, which made separating them even more necessary theologically and morally.
This is absolutely critical. It goes beyond just historical analysis. While the scholarship provided the historical reason to distance from the books, the theological and moral necessity came from the deeply problematic content within them. The text attributed to Emmerich contains stuff that's not just historically wrong, but theologically and morally untenable, according to established Catholic teaching.
What kind of problematic content are we talking about?
Well, Brentano's writings claim Emmerich talked about racialist theories, like Noah's son Ham being the ancestor of the black, idolatrous, stupid nations, linking race to spiritual failing, completely incompatible with Christian teaching on human dignity.
Okay.
But far worse and deeply concerning is the clear anti-Semitic strain in the works. The texts include the classic and vicious blood libel canard.
The blood libel. Seriously.
Brentano wrote that Emmerich believed Jews, past and present, strangled Christian children and used their blood for all sorts of suspicious and diabolical practices. It's a centuries-old, hateful fabrication used to incite violence against Jewish people.
And that creates an insurmountable theological problem for the Church. It's not just inaccuracy, it contradicts core moral teaching.
Exactly. Attributing that to a divine vision, an insurmountable theological problem. Catholic teaching is clear. Private revelation, which these visions claim to be, doesn't add new doctrines. Okay, but it absolutely cannot contradict established faith and morals.
Right.
An accusation of ritual murder is morally repugnant, a historical lie used to justify persecution. For the Church, especially post-Vatican II and Nostra Aetate's formal repudiation of anti-Semitism.
Nostra Aetate being the Vatican II document on relations with non-Christian religions.
Correct. Landmark document. So for the Church to endorse a text with that kind of material as divinely inspired, it would contradict its own solemn teaching authority, the magisterium.
So severing her cause from the books wasn't just caution, it was a necessity.
A profound theological and moral necessity. It ensured the judgment of her sanctity wasn't compromised by these incredibly damaging and indefensible elements attributed to Brentano's publication.
So after decades of debate, scholarship, theological reflection, her beatification finally moved forward, a long and difficult path.
Extremely long and complex. Veneration for the pious Beguine of Dulmen, as they called her, started right after her death in 1824. Locals thought she was a saint. Her cause was formally opened in 1892. But, as we said, the Brentano writings became this major stumbling block. As the scholarship in the early 20th century, like Humpner's work, cast doubt and revealed the problematic content, the cause stalled. November 30th, 1928, the Vatican formally halted the process, primarily because the books were deemed unreliable, potentially fabricated by Brentano. The visions were tied to her sanctity then, so discrediting them stopped everything for nearly half a century.
So after almost 45 years on hold, how did it restart in 1973? What changed?
A crucial shift in the Church's approach. Under Pope Paul VI, the decision was made. Reevaluate her life, but solely on her personal virtue, completely independent of the contested texts. This was helped because other accusations against her character had also been investigated and disproven, clearing her personal name. This shift allowed the focus onto the holiness of the person, her heroic faith, charity, patience in suffering, without having to authenticate every word attributed to her, which was impossible. A mature approach to discerning sanctity amid messy historical evidence.
And this shift led to the beatification. Pope John Paul II declared her blessed. What did he emphasize about her?
Yes, October 3rd, 2004, John Paul II beatified her in St. Peter's Square. The Vatican was very explicit, very deliberate in clarifying the grounds. They wanted no confusion, no implicit endorsement of the writings. The beatification was based exclusively on her personal life of heroic virtue, her faith, humility, patience, and suffering, proven through examining her life, witness testimony, not the content of the book.
Okay, clear distinction.
In his homily, the Pope focused on her steadfastness, strong character forged in hardship, unshakable faith, deep love for the Eucharist. He summed up her message as, "Through the wounds of Christ we have been saved," linking her personal suffering directly to the core Christian message, the kerygma. He celebrated the contrast, material poverty versus rich interior life, held her up as a model of loving dedication. The controversial writings, officially, completely set aside, no role in the judgment of her sanctity.
Despite the Vatican being so careful, so explicit, there's this clear schism, isn't there, between the official position and her popular influence. Her legacy seems tied to the very visions the Church set aside.
There is a definite schism, yes. It highlights that dynamic between official teaching and popular piety. Despite the Vatican's careful distinctions, her legacy out in the world is overwhelmingly tied to the very visions the Church set aside. Popular piety often isn't concerned with the nuances of canon law or textual criticism, right?
Yeah.
People embrace the narrative they find compelling, spiritually helpful. The books continue to circulate widely. For many, they are her voice.
And maybe nothing cemented that popular association more powerfully than Mel Gibson's 2004 film The Passion of the Christ, same year as the beatification.
Absolutely. That film brought her name to a global audience. Gibson explicitly cited the Dolorous Passion as a major source beyond the Gospels. Many of the film's most memorable graphic elements not in the Bible came straight from the Emmerich Brentano text.
Like
The extreme scourging, Jesus being flayed, the detailed interactions between Mary and Jesus on the way of the cross, Mary meeting him when he falls, the story of Veronica wiping his face, all drawn from the book.
Right.
The film's huge cultural impact meant millions were introduced to the content of her visions, creating this powerful public link between Emmerich and that specific, vivid, emotional depiction of the Passion.
And then there's the Ephesus story, the House of Mary. For many, that's the tangible proof, the single most powerful piece of external verification.
It is for many the most compelling link between her mystical experiences and verifiable reality. As we said, Eve Guyet found those ruins in 1881. Using the precise geographical and architectural descriptions from her published visions, details of terrain, the spring, the house layout, finding ruins matching those details despite her never leaving Westphalia.
It's astonishing.
Right.
That site, Mariam Anna Evi, is now a major international shrine. For believers, it's tangible, empirical proof. Her visions were real, moves it beyond subjective experience to physical evidence, seemingly.
And the Church itself, while not formally pronouncing on the house's authenticity, has shown significant favor to the site.
That's interesting.
Precisely. Never a formal, definitive statement that, yes, this was Mary's house, but significant favor through actions. Popes Leo XIII, Pius X, Paul VI, John Paul II, Benedict XVI, all either visited or sent representatives to bless the site. That lends huge prestige, reinforces its status. It's a careful balance, acknowledging the historical, spiritual significance, encouraging devotion, but maintaining official theological neutrality on claims derived from private revelation. Pragmatic, really.
So the books attributed to her keep being published, used for meditation. Her cause for canonization is still open. It really shows that dual reality, the official blessed, the popular visionary.
It does, very clearly. This clear schism exists. The Vatican built this careful firewall, separating the woman from the problematic book elements. But her popular legacy depends almost entirely on them. For many faithful, especially in more traditional circles, she is her visions. The books are spiritual guides.
And they're often published with an imprimatur.
Often, yes. Though an imprimatur usually just means no heresy found, not necessarily historical accuracy or divine inspiration of every detail, but they're widely used. Her canonization cause remains open. The Church continues studying her life, potential miracles. So you have this dual reality. Blessed Anne Catherine, the virtuous suffering nun, and popular Anne Catherine, the visionary author, discoverer of Mary's house. Popular piety creates its own powerful narrative, sometimes more influential than official judgments.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, she really emerges as this figure of irreconcilable contradictions, a tapestry of piety and paradox.
Absolutely. Piety woven with complex problems. Irreconcilable contradictions. Simple peasant credited with vast visions. Humble nun associated with anti-Semitic libels via Brentano's pen, not proven personal malice. Bedridden, invalid, inspiring archaeology and cinema. You have to hold those tensions together.
And the Vatican's judgment, separating person from text, sets this crucial modern precedent. What are the lasting theological implications?
It really does. It shows how the Church can venerate personal sanctity, heroic virtue, even when tangled with problematic texts. Separating the person from the mediated text lets the Church recognize virtue for imitation without authenticating every attributed word. It powerfully reinforces the Catholic view of private revelation. It's subordinate to public revelation, scripture, tradition. Not binding, not meant to reveal new doctrines or fix history. Its purpose, help people live the gospel more fully in their time, call them to holiness, prayer, penance.
And she lived in a very tough time for the Church. Maybe her life, her visions, even filtered, met a specific spiritual need then.
Profoundly so. You have to see her in context. Accounts call it one of the saddest and least glorious periods. Revolution, impiety, suppression of religious life after the Enlightenment, French Revolution. Her perceived mission, shared by many Catholics then, was spiritual warfare and repair. Through her intense prayer, suffering, she offered this supernatural counter-narrative to secularizing forces. Her life, her phenomena, strengthened the faith of the little ones, reminding a skeptical world the supernatural hadn't vanished. God was still active.
So, reflecting on all this, what's the final assessment? How do we hold these complexities?
Ultimately, she's potent, but deeply ambiguous. Challenges easy labels. The evidence suggests, undeniably, a woman of genuine, profound mystical sensitivity and heroic virtue. Real spiritual experiences, extraordinary holiness, suffering for others. However, her authentic experiences seem filtered, amplified, elaborated, and at times distorted through the complex literary, theological, and psychological lens of Clemens Brentano.
Okay.
Her beatification is testament to the Church's delicate but necessary act of discernment. Honor the sanctity of the life while quarantining the problematic textual legacy. It preserves the Blessed for veneration, a model of virtue, while neutralizing the controversies of the works attributed to her.
So what it means is, we've journeyed through this incredible life. Humble beginnings, profound mystical experiences, the stigmata investigations, the whole Brentano controversy. We've seen the Church's careful discernment honoring her virtue while navigating the complex literary legacy. She is somehow both Blessed Anne Catherine, the humble nun who lived for Christ, and Anne Catherine Emmerich, the contested source of visions that still fascinate and trouble the world. Her story really makes you think, doesn't it? How do we, trying to be informed, trying to be devout, discern truth and inspiration amid historical complexity, imperfect human filters, evolving understanding? And maybe, what does it truly mean to follow a path of profound love and sacrifice in our own lives like she did, even facing suffering and misunderstanding? Thank you for diving deep with us.